Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Storytime, we ride the stories of the West Campfire. Truth's trail dust memories, saloon whispers, gritty humans sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The bust in the Larkspur County Clerk's office did not float. It hung. It turned the afternoon light into dull bars that fell across the ledger and the clerk's blue sleeve. June Avery stood on the wrong side of the desk, with her father, the hem of her calico dress gray with road grit. Her needle calluses made half-moons on her fingers. A tin thimble pressed into her palm inside her pocket until it hurt. Her father smelled like cheap rye, and the kind of sweat a man wears when he has stayed up too long at a table. His collar was soft with age and worry. He would not look at her. Across the desk sat Barrett Sloan of the Double Bar S. The ring on his first finger carried the brand 2 short lines with a bar through them, bright against his weathered hand. His clothes were not fine. His boots were clean. The clean said more. He tapped the ledger with that ring. The sound was flat. The clerk coughed and pushed the inkwell forward. "Name," the clerk said. Barrett angled the pen. June watched his hand move. Fluid, no hesitation. The ring scratched the paper when it slid. He blotted the line and waited without speaking, eyes on June, the way a man looks at a horse at market. Not hunger, measurement. Her father cleared his throat and fished for words. "Mr. Sloan is a man of property. A steady man. You will eat. You will be looked after." June's mouth was dry. Sweat rolled along the hairline behind her ear and cooled in the draft from the door. She told her hand to stop crushing the thimble. It did not stop. Barrett slid 3 coins across the desk toward the clerk. The coin edges caught the light. "Preacher's fee," Barrett said. "Do it right." The clerk glanced at the coins, then at Barrett, then at June. He did not meet her eyes. He stamped the paper with a tired seal and stood. The back room at the Coyote Star smelled of spilled whiskey and stale tobacco. A wood stove popped in one corner. The preacher's collar was limp. His eyes were small and red, as if the smoke had gotten inside him and stayed. He thumbed through a damp book and found the part that was needed. June stared at a knot in the plank floor and let the words pass her like a creek that had overflowed its bank. The stove breathed, and the heat made her a little sick. She could hear the piano out in the main room, a tinny run of notes, and a laugh that hit the wall, then died. Barrett's hand closed around her forearm when the preacher told him to take it. His grip was strong and exact. He let go as soon as the words were finished. No kiss, no smile. He nodded at the preacher. He nodded at the clerk. Her father took the last coins he would likely ever take on her account and slid them into his pocket with a soft clink of metal against metal. He looked bigger for the length of a breath, then smaller. "Be good, June," he said. His voice had edges. "Mr. Sloan will make a home." She waited for him to look at her. He studied the door instead and left by it. The sound of his boots on the saloon boards went away. The piano ran up and down once more. The stove clicked as the fire settled. Barrett said, "We ride?" He did not touch her again. He took her elbow to guide her through the narrow hallway, where a serving girl shouldered through with a tray of his empty glasses and a look that did not include them. A door stood open near the kitchen where sacks of flour were stacked 3 high. A loose plank in the outer wall breathed a thin knife of cold air that lifted the hair at June's neck. She noticed the nails that should have been driven all the way home. 2 were not. Outside Whitlow's main street shone white with dust and sunlight. Flies stitched the warm air by the hitch rail. A team pulled a freight wagon past the general store. The iron tires made a rude music against the stones. A boy with a smear of dirt on his cheek watched Barrett salt and fell very still, in the way boys do around men they have been told to respect. 2 of Barrett's men waited beside the horses. One had a toothpick. One had a scar along the jaw that pulled when he smiled. They did not smile now. The horses wore the brand in dark hair along the left hip. Smoke from the blacksmith curled across the street and settled in June's throat. The man with the toothpick tipped his hat a finger's worth at Barrett. "Boss." He looked through June like she was a post. The clerk came out after them with the paper folded. He handed it to Barrett with careful fingers. Barrett tucked it into his vest and did not look down. "Saddle," he said. The closer horse was a sorrel with a kind eye and a rawhide hackamore. Its mane was uneven where someone had cut it quick. June put a hand on its neck. The skin twitched under her palm. She felt the heat of a living thing, and something steadied inside her that was not hope, but would do. Her father had led her to this rail and left her at it. She could taste the rye he had breathed. She could still feel under her pocketed palm the circle of the thimble pressing. Her fingers were strong from thread and hard work. She closed them around the saddle horn. Up, Barrett said. The word was not unkind. It was a stone. She put her left foot into the stirrup and swung. Her skirt pulled. The saddle leather squeaked. She sat, and the world lifted an inch and then another when the sorrel shifted weight. The street looked different from that height. Farther and smaller and clearer all at once. Barrett swung onto his horse with the smoothness of a man who no longer thinks about the act. The ring flashed once. He settled his hat with a thumb along the brim and looked down the street toward the open country. The men moved into place without being told. "Hold this," said the toothpick man, and offered a canteen up to Barrett. Barrett did not take it. He nodded at June. The toothpick man made a sound in his teeth and handed it to her instead. The metal was cool against her palm. She wanted to drink, then did not. The water moved inside when she tilted it and tapped the side with a quiet thud. Barrett's eyes were on the east where the road ran out of town and into tan hills with brush set like old scars. He spoke so that only she would hear. "You work. You keep quiet. You eat well if you do. There is stock that needs hands. That is all." June looked at the horses, at the sun on the telegraph wire, at the soot the smith's chimney had thrown into the hot air. Her mouth was a line. She put the canteen back. Her fingers touched the thimble again and again. The round of it fit the hollow of her hand. Barrett gathered the reins. He gave a small lift of his chin that sent the men ahead. The sorrel moved when she pressed her heels. The leather warmed under her. The town slid by in pieces. A woman at the mercantile door paused and glanced without interest. Two small girls danced to the piano inside the saloon skirt, swinging. A dog slept nose on paws in a puddle of shade beneath the freight wagon. The dog blinked once and let them pass. They reached the last building, a smithy with walls stained black above the windows. The heat from the open forge washed the road. The smell of iron and hot sand cut under the dust. June's eyes watered and then cleared. The road narrowed into country. The dust changed color when they crossed the dry creek bed and picked up the trail on the other side. Grasshoppers skipped away in clumsy leaps from the horses' hooves. Barrett's men fanned wide on either side of the trail. A magpie clattered in a cottonwood by the wash. June turned her head and saw the back of the coyote star and the kitchen storeroom wall, in memory, where that plank had moved, and the light had cut a thin blade across the sacks of flour. Cold air had touched her neck there. She felt it again as a thought, then buried it deep and held on to the horn with one hand and the canteen with the other. "Ride," Barrett said. The word went ahead of them like a shadow. The sorrel set a steady pace, and the town became a small chalk smear behind them in the pale wind. They rode. They rode until the town flattened to a chalk mark and the hills swallowed the road. The Sloan Range sat in a shallow basin ringed by wind scrub and the slow crawl of cloud shadow. A long house of gray boards faced a scatter of sheds, a bunkhouse, a cookhouse stained dark by smoke, and two corrals packed hard as stone. Cattle bawled somewhere beyond the rise, a low sea of sound. The brand sat on a gate in iron 2-bars crossed clean. Barrett halted at the rail. His men peeled off without orders. A rangy hand with a gun belt hung loose at the hip, looked June up and down, eyes flat as coins. He touched the brim of his hat to Barrett and let the gesture die before it reached her. Inside the big room was colder than the light. Trophies stared from the walls with dull glass eyes. A long table ran down the middle. A ledger lay open at one end with two neat pencils set beside it. The house smelled of old grease leather dust and the sharp note of lye. A woman stepped from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. She was stout in the shoulders, hair pinned tight, eyes like river stones. She did not curtsy or smile. "Dot Pike," Barrett said. "This is June. She stays out back. Put her to work." Dot gave June a look that landed and held. Not pity, not interest. "Measure? Come on," she said. She turned and June followed her, through the swing door, into a room lit yellow by a cook stove. Heat breathed steady, the stove skin popping now and then like a small animal. Strips of salted pork hung from hooks. A pan of biscuits cooled on a towel. A black kettle hummed. "You wash," Dot said, setting a tin basin on a rough table. Hands faced behind the ears, clean under the nails. "There is soap." She set a small cake at the color of bone beside the basin. The water was warm. June cupped it and watched the grit unwind from her fingers in cloudy threads. The sting at her knuckles woke the nerves. Dot laid a folded dress on a chair. It was serviceable brown, high in the neck, long in the sleeve. "Wear this when you work. keep the other for nothing. Boots. June shook her head. Dot glanced at her feet, then at a shelf. She found a pair of old lace-ups with split seams. Stuff rags in the toes. It will hold. There is a cot, Dot said. She pushed open a narrow door to a small room off the kitchen. No window, only a vent cut high. A narrow bed, a trunk with no lock, a nail in the wall for a dress. It was clean because there was nothing in it. June set her small bundle on the trunk and stood for a breath in the doorway. The heat from the stove made a line on the floor. The air smelled of flour and smoke and the iron sweetness of stew. Dot's voice came again, even and firm. Supper for the men at 6, coffee at dawn, scrub pans, pluck if there is plucking, mind your elbows, mind your tongue. If he speaks you answer yes, Mr. Sloane. June swallowed. Yes, she said. They worked. Dot moved like a woman who had learned the house until her body knew it better than her mind. She showed June where the knives sat clean and sharp, where the sugar was kept under a dish to keep out flies, how the oven ran hot on the left side and colder on the right. June's hands found work at once. Flour to board, biscuits to pan, chickens to a bucket that waited in the yard. She had plucked before. Feathers clung to her wrists and hair. She wiped her forearms with the back of her hand, then reached for the next bird. One of the men ducked his head in at the door and swallowed a grin when he saw her, elbow deep in down. Cade Mercer, someone called from the porch. The man with the grin turned his head toward the voice. His jaw had a ropey scar that tugged when he chewed a toothpick. He winked like a man tossing a coin in mud and left the doorway. At 6, they carried platters to the long table. Men came in by 2s and 3s. They ate with the quiet of hunger met. They did not speak to June. They ate what was set down and looked past her eyes sliding like the eyes of cattle through rails. When Barrett entered, the air changed half a shade. The men straightened. Spoons paused. He sat at the head and picked up knife and fork and did not look left or right. June poured his coffee. His hand brushed the handle as she set the cup down. His ring edge ticked the ceramic. After supper, Dot set a tub by the stove and poured kettle water until steam rose soft. She nodded at the tub. "Get the feathers off you," she said. June washed until her skin flushed pink and left damp prints on the floorboards. She put on the brown dress. She laced the split boots and tucked the rag deeper with a finger. Night gathered quick. Wind nosed the eaves. Men's boots thumped on the porch, then quieted. The big room went dim. Barrett's steps crossed the floor with the slow certainty of a man walking his own land. He pushed the kitchen door with 2 fingers. Dot's shoulders went still. Barrett said to Dot, "Coffee at sunup." Then he looked at June. His face did not change. "With me, Mrs. Sloane." The small room off the kitchen took his shadow and gave it back to him on the wall. He closed the door. The latch clicked a neat sound. June stood by the cot. The air in the room shifted, as if it had been holding its breath all day. The next minutes had no shape she wanted to keep. They did not spill, and they did not stay. When the door opened again, the lamp in the kitchen made a square on the floor, and then it was gone. The latch caught a second time. June lay on her side and watched the square fade from her eyes. She breathed and counted until the counting did not help. Morning began in the dark. Dot knocked once and opened the door with the same motion. "Up," she said. June swung her legs over the side bones, heavy skin sore where fingers had left shadow marks. She moved slow until the heat of the stove took the stiffness away from her joints. Water, coffee, batter, fire. The rhythm pressed down, then took her weight. Days stacked. June learned the house by light. The way the window in the pantry trapped cold air behind a cracked pane. The way a loose board along the lower frame lifted a hair when the wind ran north. Nails hammered flat against the wood. Too deep, too shy. The way the door to the backyard stuck at the bottom unless you lifted when you pulled. The way footsteps on the porch told you who it was before you saw. Cade heavy on his heels. Barrett even unhurried exact. Cade's voice carried one evening from the big room, smooth with grease and laughter. "She is quiet, not skittish, strong in the back." He spoke as if he were discussing a horse. June stood in the pantry counting jars and listened without moving. The little cracked pain bled cold along her cheek. Barrett's reply was softer. "Quiet does not mean stupid. She cooks, she mends, she keeps a house." He paused as if that were a sum. "My last was barren. I need sons. If she does not take their scorpion wash. Men out there need hands. They need a cook." June touched the wood with the tips of her fingers and kept them there until she felt the splinters as points of heat. Dot set a plate in front of June later, when the men were gone. "Eat," Dot said. June stared at the stew and the bread and did as she was told. Dot's face did not change. Her hands were square and sure. When she lifted a pot, the muscles in her forearms showed clean. A woman like that carried more than pots in a place like this. On the porch, coyotes sang thin in the dark. The house settled on its haunches. June washed the last pan and set it upside down on the rack. She wiped the table in long, even lines. She hung the towel in its place. She put the broom in the corner with the bristles up. The lamp hissed. The stove ticked as if counting the seconds to ash. She stepped into her small room and closed the door with care and listened to the latch seat in its keep. She lay on the cot and stared at the vent. The air that came through it smelled of night and the faintest thread of damp. Her palm found the curve of the thimble in her pocket. The metal had warmed to her skin. Her other hand found the bruise on her arm and held it as if it were a handle that might steady her. The house had a rhythm now. She learned it until it knocked inside her own bones. Night held the house like a lid. The stove in the kitchen breathed low and steady. The big room had gone quiet except for a chair leg scuff and a laugh that cracked, then thinned to nothing. June lay on the cot and watched the vent in the wall. The air that seeped through it tasted like cold iron. Her hand found the thimble in her pocket and closed until her fingers ached. Barrett's steps crossed the floor once and then again. Doors opened and shut with the calm of ownership. His voice came low from the front room, a single word to Cade, then silence. Boots thumped the porch. Spurs sang softly. The yard settled. Dot pushed the kitchen door with her hip and banked the coals until only a red eye showed through ash. She rinsed 2 cups, turned the mouth down, and hung the towel straight on its nail. When she passed the small room, she did not look in. June heard her tread fade toward the cot by the pantry door. The house breathed. June counted the breaths until she knew the measure. She sat up without letting the cot ropes creak, slid her feet to the floor, and waited for the boards to remember her weight. Her hand found the dress she had folded on the trunk and pulled it over her head by feel. She gathered her hair in both hands and twisted it into a knot at her neck, fingers clumsy and quick. She opened her door and froze. The kitchen lay in a soft dark, the stove a shape with a heart. Dot's shape was in a chair by the pantry, head tilted to the side, arms folded. June stood until her eyes stung, listening for breath. There it was, even and slow. The woman slept with a wooden spoon across her lap like a guard. June crossed the boards on the outsides of her feet. The peg by the back door held 3 coats. She touched the first, linen thin as a sheet. The second was a heavy wool that smelled of horse and sweat and smoke. She took that. It dragged at her shoulders with a weight that felt like safety and danger at once. On the table sat a loaf cut that afternoon. She tore a heel the size of her palm and wrapped it in a rag. The rag was clean. She had washed it herself. The pantry smelled of flour, dried apples, and mice. Cool collected there the way water collects in a hollow. June put her hand along the lower frame where the nails were hammered in flat and shallow. The board lifted a finger's width when she pressed. She slid her fingers under it and hissed when a splinter went in deep. She bit the inside of her cheek and pulled the board toward her slow. The sound was long and mean. She stopped and waited. The house did not stir. Dot's breath did not change. June tried again, easing the wood back and up, until cold night air cut along her forearms like a blade. The opening was small and low. She slid the heavy coat through first, then the bread. She laid down flat, pressed one shoulder through, then the other. The rough edge sawed at her back. Her hips stuck. She exhaled small and steady and pushed. The wood scraped her spine. Her breath made a thin animal sound in her throat. She turned her face to the side to keep the flour dust out of her mouth and felt the grain of the board against her teeth. Then she was through, and the ground took her, with a dull thud that woke a small cry she caught with her hand. The yard lay in a gray that was not light. The bunkhouse was a darker block against darker sky. The stars were thin. The wind had a bite. Somewhere far a cow lowed in its sleep. June lay on her belly, with her cheek in the dirt, and listened. No voices, no beats of a boot. Her bare feet felt the ground as if it were a living thing. She reached back through the gap and pulled the board up enough to set it in place with her fingers. It would not fool a man with eyes. It would slow a man who was not looking. She did not take the split boots. Boots told the ground where you were. Bare feet told you where the ground was. She pulled on the coat and it swallowed her. She tucked the rag with the bread into the pocket until her hand touched a nail head caught in the weave. She pulled her hand back and smelled the iron on her skin. She moved along the shadow of the house and across the hard ground by the smokehouse, where the air held the cold smell of bacon. The corral fence was 5 boards high. She put her fingers on the top rail and felt frost flower there. She found a low place by the gate and slid through. A dog slept in a coil near the post and lifted its head without barking eyes like coals. She did not look at it. She kept her steps small and even. The dog laid its head back down and sighed. She did not take the road. The road ran straight and easy, like a thought men could follow. She moved into the brush toward the low black shape of the hills that cupped the basin like a hand. Sage scraped her shins and left a smell that was bitter and clean. The coat dragged at her knees. Her feet learned the rocks and the soft places, and the stickers that lifted and bit. She did not hurry. She did not stop. By the time the yard was a dark patch behind her, her breath sat high and sharp in her chest. She gave herself a small bite of bread and let it soften on her tongue before she swallowed. The wind carried dust. The dust made a fine grit on her teeth. The coat warmed where her shoulders pushed against it. Her legs ached where Cade's talk had turned to hands and left a memory. She set thought aside like a heavy pot and carried only what would fit in a pocket. A wash drew a thin line through the ground, the sand fine and cold. She walked in it for the soft sound, and the cover careful not to leave prints where the curve held damp. The stars shifted, and through the thin silver of the north along a ridge, coyotes lifted their voices far off and let them fall. Her ears found the space between sounds and walked there. The sky began to thin at the far edge of the world. The cold lifted and settled again. She crouched in a stand of rabbit brush and waited for the light to make her a shape. She lay down and pulled the coat over her shoulders and tucked her feet under her thighs. The earth gave its heat slow. When she slept, it was a fall with no bottom. When she woke, her jaw hurt from clenching. She stood with the sun and felt the burn in the arches of her feet. When she set them down, the skin stuck and then let go with a wet pull. She ate another small bite and kept the taste of it in her mouth as long as she could. The land rolled away in low waves, yellow and pale. A hawk hung against a piece of blue and wrote circles in the air. June kept the morning sun on her right shoulder and the sound of her own steps where she could bear it. By noon, the coat felt like a man on her back. She stopped in the thin shade of a boulder and found a trickle under it, a seam of water stained green. She cupped it with both hands and drank. It tasted like a tin cup left out in the rain and like life. She drank again until her belly hurt. She put her face to the damp and held it there and let the cold run into her skin. The land made a low sound then, horses, far and slow. She did not lift her head. She slid under the boulder until the rock bit her spine and the coat filled the space with a smell that was someone else, old and tired. She lay with her cheek against grit. Ants touched her wrist with indecent purpose and marched on. The sound of the horses grew and then thinned and then grew again somewhere else. Men talking became wind and grass. She did not breathe until breathing happened on its own. When she finally looked out, the ridge was empty. She moved again, smaller, flatter, patient. Twice more she heard men and let the land hold her. In the afternoon, the light went white and hard. Heat rose in a shimmer that lied about distance. Her feet left small marks now, not from weight, but from blood. She would not look at them. She thought of a canteen, and the thought made her tongue swell. She chewed the last of the bread and swallowed hope with it dry. Clouds built and then lost their will. The sun slid. The wind turned cool and cruel. June spoke out loud because without a voice, a person could get lost inside. West, she told herself. Keep west. The sound was a thread. She held it and walked. The coat flapped when a gust hit. The rag in her pocket was light now. Her fingers found the thimble and pressed it into the bone of her palm until a bruise rose. When she stumbled the first time, she caught herself and stood a long time with her head down and breath loud. When she stumbled the second time, she went to her hands and knees and stayed. The ground was a page of small stones. One lodged under her cheekbone and became the whole world. She listened for horses and heard nothing but the close rush of her own blood. The sky to the east had begun to color. The smell of the dirt was a dry sweetness, old as anything. She put her hands under her chest and tried to push. Her arms trembled and did not lift her. She laid her head down on the ground and watched a beetle cross a space of 2 inches as if it were a map. Her eyes burned and then cooled. The coat held a little warmth. She put her mouth against her sleeve and closed her teeth on the wool to keep from making a sound. The plain stretched on in a gray that asked for nothing. She gave it her weight and let her eyes fall shut. The sound reached her before the shape. Slow hooves on crusted ground. A horse at a walk, not searching, not running. June lifted her head and the world tilted. The light had gone gray. The coat held a little heat against her ribs. She saw a shadow slide across the sun, and then a man on a lean buckskin stopped above her. The horse breathed steam. The man did not speak. He swung down and knelt. A scar pulled one corner of his mouth into a hard line. His hat brim hid his eyes until he tipped it back to look. He took in the coat too big for her, the torn hem, the bare feet with the skin split and dark. His gaze moved to the east. The country lay empty except for the kind of emptiness that hides men. June said one word, "Please." He stood and went to his saddle. He brought a canteen. He crouched again. "Drink slow," he said. His voice sat low in the chest worn by weather more than whiskey. He lifted her head with his hand behind her neck. The water hit her tongue, and her throat reached for it like a rope thrown from a well. It hurt, and then it eased. He took the canteen away before she was ready and waited. He watched the land while she swallowed. He looked at her a long moment, then at the line of her tracks. A blind man could follow this, he said. He set his jaw as if he did not like the next thing he would do. He slid his arms under her and lifted. She weighed less than the coat. The motion woke sparks of pain in her feet. She pressed her teeth together and let her head fall against his chest. He set her across the front of the saddle. He wrapped a blanket from his roll around her and tied it with a practiced twist. He mounted behind one arm, a bar to keep her steady, then pointed the horse toward the high ground that cut the wind. The air cooled. Cloud shadow crossed the plain in long gray hands. They climbed a wash choked with Stonan cottonwood. A hawk flared white above the ridge and vanished. By the time the first hard flakes began to sting her face, the buckskin had found a narrow path into the pines. The cabin stood on a shelf of rock above a coulee. Logs chinked tight. A low roof of shakes held a cap of old snow. A short stack of cut wood sat by the door under a lean-to. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin blue seam. The man slid down, eased her to his arms, and shouldered the door open with his hip. Warmth came at her in a soft wave. Pine smoke and old leather. He set her on a cot by the hearth. His hand found the poker, and he built the small fire into a bigger one with 2 quick moves and the patience of someone who lives with flame. He set a kettle to the side of the heat and hung a pot from a hook. He took off his hat and coat and shook the snow to the floor by the door. He glanced at her feet and then looked away. "I need to see," he said. "I can work gentle or I can work fast. Gentle takes longer and hurts more. Fast does not mean rough." She swallowed. The pain sat there already like a guest. He brought a wooden bowl and a bag of coarse salt. He poured water from the kettle until steam rose. He tossed in a handful of salt. He knelt waiting until the heat would burn him, not her. He cut the hem of the dress away from her ankles with a small knife so sharp she did not feel the blade. He took her feet in his hands. His fingers were rough from rope and rain, yet his touch had weight without harm. The first dip into the salt water brought pain so clean she forgot how to breathe. It ran up her shins and set sparks in her teeth. She grabbed the blanket and made fists until the bones of her hands showed. "Be still," he said. "This part is bad." He did not look at her face while he spoke. He watched the water and the skin and the way blood lifted and made threads. He worked quiet. He worked until the cuts were clean and the dirt gone. He worked until the raw parts showed as they were. He dried her feet and wrapped them with strips torn from a shirt that had already given its sleeves. He opened a small crock and rubbed a salve that smelled of pine resin and animal fat along the bandages. She had not heard her own breathing until it began to quiet. He sat back on his heels and wiped his hands on a rag. He reached for the pot and tasted what simmered. "Rabbit," he said. He ladled broth into a tin cup and set it on a stool within reach. He poured water into another cup and set it beside the broth. "Eat when you can," he said. He stood and went to the door. He lifted the bar and opened it. A sheet of white rushed in and the room pulled tight against it. He stepped into the gust and was gone. The door closed and the bar fell into place with a sound that felt like a promise. She listened. The wind drummed on the roof. Snow hissed along the sill. The fire talked to itself. The room was simple. A table with 2 chairs. A shelf with a Bible too small to be for show. A peg line with a few shirts and a second coat hanging brushed and mended. A gun belt coiled like a sleeping snake near the door. A small bundle of carving chips lay on the table, and a wooden bird half born from a block sat among them with its eye not yet cut. She reached for the water first. It was cool and clean. It tasted of tin and smoke and something like stone. The broth eased down and left heat behind. She held the cup in both hands and let the heat climb into her fingers and up her arms. The door opened, and the wind tried for the room again. The man came in with snow stacked on his shoulders and hat brim. He shut the storm behind him and stood close to the fire with his hands out. He did not look at her, as if to give her a place to be that had nothing to do with his eyes. He stamped his boots once on the flat stone and took them off and set them near the door. The horse, he said. He did not finish. The way he moved said the animal had hay and a roof of some kind. He went to the peg and took down a dry shirt. He turned his scar to the wall and changed quick, efficient chafing his arms with the cloth. He put the wet shirt near the fire on a chair back. He looked at her feet at the cups at the pot. His eyes were dark and guarded, but the guard was not aimed at her. "My name is Cole Harper," he said. "You can call me Cole." He paused as if to leave room for her to trade a name for a name. She did not. He nodded once as if that was the answer he expected. "The door locks from the inside. The bar is heavy. I sleep on the floor. If you need water, say it or knock the cup over." He took a blanket roll from under the cot and set it near the far wall. He laid himself down with his back to her, a hand near the coiled belt, but not on it. He watched the line of light under the door for a while, without moving, then closed his eyes. June watched the fire reflect along the barrel of the rifle on its pegs and make a weak star on the wall. The storm grew. The wind lifted and laid down, lifted and laid down. Once she woke with a choke in her throat. The room was dark, but for the red of the coals. Cole did not turn to her. He sat up and fed the fire without looking at her face. He added thin sticks, then thicker, then a log, when the draw took. The light climbed the logs and ran along the ceiling in a slow dance. He sat for a time and listened to the roof. Then he lay back down without a word. In the morning there was no morning. The window showed a blind white. The light was all of a kind. Cole stood and opened the door a crack. Snow pressed against it like a body. He leaned his shoulder and moved adrift a little and shut it again. He set coffee to boil and put cornmeal in the pan with a little fat and made Johnny cake. He set a square on a plate and slid it across the table. He poured her coffee and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. He took his own to the door and drank with his shoulder to the jamb, as if holding the house up. The pain in her feet had sharpened into something she could count. She tried to stand and the room narrowed. She sat again with her hands white on the table edge. He watched in the glass of the window, not by turning. He set his cup down and came to kneel. His hands hovered over her ankles and then settled. "Do not walk on them," he said. He looked up and kept his face still. "I am not that man. I will only touch you for doctoring and for getting you to water if you fall. You are safe here until the storm quits and we see the ground again." Her mouth shaped a word before she had picked it. Why? He looked toward the wall where a map hung. The paper was brown with age and the edges had gone soft. The lines showed the country north to rail towns and south to canyons, where men had cut up mountains for a living. He did not look at the map long. He looked back at her feet. "I have done harm enough," he said. The words came as if they had been set near a door for a time, and picked up only when needed. "It costs me nothing to do this." He rose and took the small block from the table. He sat by the fire and turned it in his hands. His knife came out of nowhere, and the sound of it against wood was a quiet talk. A bird's back came from the square, then the tail. He did not carve with show. He carved like a man trimming a rope end so it would not fray. June ate in small bites. The coffee pushed heat into her chest. The cabin began to belong to the sounds it made, the knife on wood, the fire's breath, the clock that was no clock, the slow tap of snow from the shakes. She looked at the map and the marks made there in a man's hand. There was an X in the north where the pass ran down to a town that might have been a rumor to her one day and was now only lines and a letter she could not read from the bed. Cole set the knife aside and stood. He went to the peg and took down a length of rawhide and a twisted line of willow. He tested both and set them by the door. He glanced at her again in the glass and said, "You can tell me your name when you want, or never." He lifted the bar and opened the door a careful hand's width. Snow fell in a soft slab. He moved it with the shovel that had been leaning there like a gray dog and gave the door its swing back. He went out into the white and left the door close behind him with a thick, small sound. June lay back and let the rough wool scratch the skin above the bandage. She watched the wooden bird on the table. It looked like a thing ready to fly that did not know the room had a roof. She did not take her hand from her thimble. She turned it under her fingers as if it were a coin that could buy something you could not name. The fire's heat reached her face. The pain sat where it sat. The snow pressed at the window. The cabin held. When Cole came in again, he was a shape rhymed with white. He shook himself at the threshold and eased the door shut. The wind had dropped a note. He hung the shovel back on its nail. He looked at her, not hard, not soft. "Rest," he said. He put the half-carved bird on the sill where the light could find it. The knife went back into its own place as if it knew the road. He settled by the hearth, his back to the stone's eyes on the coals. Outside, the world went on without color. Inside, the color was fire on wood and the brown of coffee and the blue of a cup that had been fired without much care. He set his hat on his knee and watched the flames work. June watched the slow breath lift and drop his chest and felt her own lungs learn that measure. The day folded itself along the seams of snow and fire and did not ask for anything except to be lived through. Days learned the shape of the cabin. Snow pressed at the window until the light went to milk. The fire breathed and held. June slept in fits and woke with the ache in her feet bright as a match, and then not. Cole moved through the room with a quiet that belonged to people who have lived alone a long time. He made coffee. He turned meat in a pan with the back of a knife. He rinsed a cup and set it down just so. He spoke when the work needed words. Lift, hold, drink slow. He did not ask questions that had no use. When she could sit up without the world narrowing, he brought a basin and a cloth. He set it on the floor and waited. She drew the blanket aside and watched her own hands. He untied the bandages and watched her feet. The skin had gone from broken to raw, and then to tender new. He washed them with water he had tested on his wrist. He dried them and rubbed salve. His touch had weight and direction without hunt. He wrapped fresh cloth, neat and even. "You will stand in time," he said. She nodded because the word time felt like a place she could see from here. While the storm kept its grip, they built a small rhythm. He banked fire, scraped plates, checked the roofline by listening. She peeled potatoes with a short knife and took pride in making the peels long without breaking. She mended one of his shirts that had given itself for her bandages. The cloth had turned soft with age. She sewed small and straight. The needle went in and came out in a line that told her hands what to do next. Her thimble fit the finger as if it had been waiting for it. He watched the window when the wind shifted. He put on his coat and hat and went out to the lean-to to feed the horse and clear the drift from the door. He came back with snow in his hair and heat in his face. He shook off and set his boots by the hearth. He took up the block of wood and carved until a wing appeared under the point of the knife. The small bird found shape a little at a time. He did not hurry it. She said her name on a day when the wind slept. He had set coffee on the table and stepped back. The warmth rose from the cup in a small ghost. She watched it and then said June. Cole looked up and nodded once as if a piece in his head had clicked into its place. He did not say the name back. He used it later, when he needed it, the way a man uses a rope that has already been coiled. That night, a dream climbed over the cot and covered her face. A room that smelled of whiskey and iron. A hand that was a cuff. Her body forgot to move. She woke with a sound jammed in her throat. The room was dark except for coals the color of cherries. Cole did not speak a comfort with soft edges. He rose and added tinder, then sticks, then a log, until the room held a warm hold. The light moved up the walls. He sat on his heels by the hearth and watched the flame. He did not turn to her, and he did not make the space small. He let the fire do what he knew it could do. After a time, her breath found its old shape. He lay down on his bed by the door, with his back turned and his hand near the belt that slept coiled. The silence took them both and kept them. When the storm gave ground, it did it slow. The sky thinned to a color that had blue in it. Snow sank and locked along the eaves. Cole cut 2 sticks and shaved them until they fit her underarms. He patted the tops with folded cloth and bound them tight. He set them by the cot and stood quiet while June looked at them. "I can try," she said. He stood a step away, his hands down. She set the crutches under her and pushed herself up. Her vision tightened, then widened. The cabin tilted, then came back level. She took a breath and set the crutches forward and let her good weight swing into the next space. The bandage feet kissed the floor and came away. She took 3 steps and stopped and looked at the fire as if it were a person. She smiled without knowing she did. "Good," Cole said. She learned the room by the reach of her arms. Table to shelf, shelf to door, door to chair. She moved slow and neat. When she was ready, she peeled carrots with her weight, settled on the good foot, and her shoulder against the table edge. He shaped dough and baked a pan of biscuits that came out a little too dark on one side and a little pale on the other. He grunted and ate them anyway. She laughed once, a small sound that surprised them both. By noon, the sky was a clean sheet. The drift by the door had gone to a slope. Cole shouldered it aside until a path showed rock. He looked toward the mouth of the draw and stood long with his hands on his hips. He turned and came back in and set the rifle on the table. When the ground is bare enough, he said, "You should learn this." She looked at the rifle and then at her hands. No. His face stayed quiet. "You do not have to love it. You need to know it. It is a thing in the world. If you know it, it cannot sit above you as a god." She looked down at the bread dough under her palms. She pressed it and folded it and turned it and found the rhythm. She did not answer. The next morning, the path held. Trees showed their dark bones against the sky. The wind had gone somewhere else. He wrapped her feet into old wool socks and tied them root tight. He set her in the doorway with the crutches and then lifted her down the 2 steps in his arms without making her feel small. He put the rifle into her hands and stepped back. "Hold with both. Bring it to you. Do not go to it. Feet under you, shoulder behind the butt, cheek on the stock. Breathe out. Do not close your eyes." There was a tin can on a post 20 paces away. The morning carried the smell of clean pine and cold iron. June set the rifle as he said and felt the unwanted shake in her arms. She breathed. She squeezed. The roar punched her in the shoulder and reached through her teeth. The shot tore a clean hole in the blue above the can. She jerked and blinked and felt heat rush into her face. "Again," Cole said. She tried once more. The sight cut the air where she put it. The trigger had a take-up and then a wall and then a break that she learned as she lived it. Smoke lifted and was gone. The can stayed white and whole. She set the rifle down with hands that had forgotten strength. "I hate it," she said. He nodded. "Good." He took the rifle into his own hands and fired once. The can jumped and fell into the snow. He left it there. They walked back to the cabin slow, her arms shaking and her feet a steady dull. When they reached the door, she held the edge and looked at the sky. It had a wide that made her heart hurt, and then ease. In the cabin she sat and rubbed her shoulder, where the recoil had laid a new mark. Cole made coffee and set a cup near her hand. He took thread and a needle and bent his head over the shirt she had mended, to pull a stitch tighter where his thumb found it loose. His hands were big and knew small work. A quiet grew that was not empty. Her hair had turned into a snarl that reached from nape to crown. It made a shadow of itself. She set the comb against it and pulled and hissed and threw the comb on the table with a sound. Cole looked over and then back at his work. "I can do that if you like," he said. She stared. "Do what? Comb it, braid it. I am good with knots." She laughed again, quick and disbelieving. He set the shirt aside and moved the chair behind hers. He picked up the comb and did not touch her until she nodded. He gathered her hair in one hand and let it rest there until the weight felt like hers again. He started at the ends and worked up, teasing out the tangles with the comb in his fingers. He did not pull more than he had to. The scrape of the teeth made a soft sound that matched the sound the fire made. He sectioned the hair and braided it tight and even and set the tail with a tie he pulled from his pocket. He laid the braid over her shoulder so she could see it. There, she touched it. It felt like order. "Thank you," she said. He sat back. His face had not changed much, but something around his eyes had let go and settled. He picked up the shirt again and took the needle where it needed to go. In the afternoon, he went to check a snare line he had set in the trees when the storm had begun to turn. He came back with a rabbit and hands cold enough to hurt when they warmed. She cleaned the animal on the back step with motions she had learned before and wished she had not learned so young. He rinsed the meat and set it to stew with onions and a piece of salt pork cut thin. The smell filled the room and made a new memory pull over the old. After supper, June stood at the table while Cole cleaned the rifle. He set the pieces in a row on a folded cloth. He ran oil on a patch through the barrel until it came out without stain. He touched each part with a kind of respect that did not look like love. "Teach me that part," she said. He did. He named the pieces and handed them to her one by one. She put the names where the shapes would hold them: bolt, spring, follower. He watched the way her fingers learned the work and did not correct when correction was only a way to hear himself talk. When she reassembled the rifle without losing a screw, he said, "Good." The night stood around the cabin. Stars threw themselves over the ridge. The stove made a small tick as the iron cooled and warmed. June watched Cole's hands and then stopped watching his hands and looked at his face. He felt the look and met it. She stood with her weight on the good foot. She felt an edge rise inside that was not fear and was not safe. She crossed the floor as if there were boards that would remember this step and carry it forward. She stopped in front of him and the world folded small. "May I?" she said. His throat worked. He nodded once. She leaned in and put her mouth on his. It was not smooth. It had the taste of coffee and wood smoke. Her heart struck hard enough to make the breath go strange. For a second, it was only the warm press of two people who had gone cold for a long time, and were finding proof that they were not stone. Then her body filled with a rush that brought dark rooms and a hand on her wrist. Her throat closed, her chest locked. She stepped back with a sound she could not hold. "I am sorry," she said. "I thought. I am not ready." Cole stayed where he was. He did not reach. He put his hands palms down on his knees as if to keep them quiet. His voice came low and steady. "Then we wait until you are." She nodded and could not look at him and went to the cot and sat and put her hands over her face and let heat move through her. Not grief, not fear, something that hurt and healed in the same space. He rose, took his coat from the peg, and went out into the cold. She heard the crunch of his boots and the quiet talk he gave the horse without thinking. When he came back in, he hung the coat and sat near the hearth and sharpened the small knife with slow strokes until the sound made her breathe easier. Later, she lay with the braid under her cheek and the taste of coffee still in her mouth. The cabin held again. The fire worked. The map watched from the wall without telling anyone what to do. Cole slept by the door, his back turned and his palm on the floor. June looked at the wooden bird on the sill. Its head had taken shape without eyes. The room kept its promises of heat water and quiet. Her hands found the thimble without hunting and settled around it like a nest. The night passed as nights do when people in it decide to let it. Morning opened clean and blue. Snow had pulled back from the pines, leaving wet black earth and needles that smelled sharp. Cole split a short stack of wood, while June sat by the door with her feet wrapped, and the rifle across her lap, wiping oil along the barrel until the rag came away pale. Her braid lay heavy over one shoulder. The wooden bird watched from the sill with its head half made. She carried a bucket to the spring that seeped out of the rock behind the cabin. The water was cold enough to bite. She cooled her hands and filled the bucket and stood a moment to let her breath settle. When she lifted her head, she saw it, a dark prickle on the far ridge to the east. A horse and a man small as a nail hit. The man raised something to his face. Light winked along glass and died. He turned his horse and disappeared behind a fold of hill. June set the bucket down without spilling. "Cole," she said. He came out with his shirt sleeves rolled. He followed her eyes to the ridge. His face did not change. He took the bucket from her and set it by the door. Inside, he folded a square of paper off the shelf and laid it flat on the table. He took out a small bottle of ink with a cork dark at the tip. He opened a drawer and brought up a pen with a steel nib that had bitten many pages. He set them in a line and looked at June. "If you want words in a room that is not this room," he said now. She sat. Her hands felt large and clumsy. He slid the pen to her. He set his knife on the table and began to draw the edge along a stone. The sound was steady and low. "To the Honorable Judge Ephraim Whitaker of Larkspur County," she wrote. The nib scratched. Ink shone wet before it dulled. She told it in pieces that fit through the narrow of her throat. "My father, Oliver Avery. Debt. The clerk. The back room at the Coyote Star. Barrett Sloan of the Double Bar S." She wrote how hands had held her by the arm and not as a kindness. She wrote what she had been called. She wrote the word Scorpion Wash in letters that shook once and then went straight. Cole kept the knife on the stone and let that sound be the breath of the room. When the pen stalled, he asked only what moved the story forward. What day? What man? What room? When she wrote about the window in the pantry and the loose board, her fingers slowed. She took in air as if the small room had come back around her. He set the stone down and said ink, and pushed the bottle closer so she would have a reason to stop without stopping. By noon, the page smelled of iron. The sun had slid around the window, and the bird's uncut eye held a bright curve. June set the pen in its groove and flexed her fingers. There was black in the half-moons of her nails. She wrote her name at the bottom and did not add anything to it. June Avery. Cole read without speaking. His jaw worked once. He folded the letter along clean lines and set it by the coffee tin. Clouds had built from the west. Wind came through the draw and pushed the cold under the door with a hand. Rain found the roof by afternoon. It came steady and close. The trail would be soup at the wash. They sat with the sound. Cole put the folded letter in a small oilskin envelope and rubbed tallow along the edges with his thumb. When the rain eased, they saddled Smoke and the small dun mare that stood in the lean-to like an extra thought. June wrapped her feet and laced the old boots tight. Cole lifted her up. Her hands found the horn the way they used to find the head of a spoon in a dark kitchen. They rode past the coulee through a stretch of sage that had kept its color under snow and into country that unrolled in long yellow gray. The air carried the smell of wet dust and iron from the rocks. They crossed the dry creek where the clay pulled at the horse's shoes and left a curl behind. Cole took the lead and kept the pace easy. Whitlow was still Whitlow, sun on white dust. A dog stretched on the boardwalk as if it owned wood. A team stood with their tails tied with bits of rag to keep them off the wheels. The blacksmith's smoke curled lazy. The coyote star swung its sign, the coyote's paint chipped on the ear. They tied off in front of the saloon. Men turned their heads the way birds do, like the neck springs, more than the eye. Cole took the oilskin from his vest and set his hand on the door. Inside, light slanted across the long room. A piano sat in the corner as if it had been moved there 100 times and never belonged anywhere else. Tables had been pushed back from the floor to make space. A battered flag hung over a scarred desk. Judge Ephraim Whitaker sat behind it with his coat off and his shirt sleeves rolled neat. He was thin and gray and the kind that could take a room apart with his eyes and put it back together in the order he liked. Barrett Sloane had come clean. His vest hung smooth, his boots had a quiet shine. The ring with the brand caught the light once and put a thin line on the wall. Cade Mercer stood behind him with a toothpick and half a smile that pulled his scar. A murmur ran the wall and then went out. Cole and June stepped forward until they felt the press of eyes from the sides and the weight of men's breath in the air. Judge Whitaker took the letter and slit the oilskin with a small knife that lived in his pocket. He read with his mouth set. He made no noise when a sentence asked for it. He folded the page once, not along the old crease, and set it to the left, as if that were where read things went. He looked at Barrett. "Mr. Sloane," he said, "these are grave charges. Speak." Barrett's voice fit the room as if it had been made for it. "Judge, this is my wife. She is young. She is confused. This man," he tipped his chin at Cole, "has taken a shine to telling a story. He is a drifter. He took her for his camp and made her say a thing in ink to shame a man. I am a man of property. This is a private matter." Judge Whitaker looked at June. "Miss," he stopped and then said, "Mrs. Sloane," and the way he said it was not a concession. He meant the title and the question at once. "Did Mr. Harper abduct you?" June felt the floor under her boots. She looked at the judge, then at the paper on his desk, then at Barrett's ring. The brand wove light and shadow over his knuckle. "No, sir," she said. "Speak up," said the judge. "No, sir," she said. "I ran." "Why?" June's throat drew tight. The room smelled of beer gone old and lemon oil rubbed thin on wood. She saw Dot Pike's hands and the loose board, and Cade's grin like a slice. She saw the stove ringed red. She made herself see the ledger in the clerk's office and the copper coins walking across the desk to buy a word that should not be for sale. "He hurt me," she said. "He held me wrong. He spoke of me like stock. He paid my father. He did not ask me." She made the sentences small enough to pick up and pass along. None of them had the names that lived under them, and all of them did. Barrett laughed once. The sound was a tool. He shook his head and let the ring kiss his jaw in thought, then faced the judge again without the humor. The judge did not look at him. He looked at Cole. "Your piece, Mr. Harper." Cole's voice came steady. "I found her east of here," he said. "Barefoot, feet to meat and blood, no water. I gave her mine. I cleaned her feet and wrapped them. The marks on her arms were hands. The one on her face was a hand. Her dress had been cut for bandage, not for show. I kept the door barred on the inside. I slept by it. I did not touch her for anything but water, and the work of fixing hurt. She chose to write. She put her name. That is the whole of my part." Cade rolled the toothpick and let it click on a tooth. He did not speak. His hand lay near the butt of his pistol, like a hand near a dog it knows too well. The judge rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at the clerk who had been pulling at a pen with his mouth and not writing. The clerk found a blotter and flattened it with both palms. Judge Whitaker lifted the letter again and read the last lines aloud. He set it down and let his fingers rest on it. "Mr. Sloane," he said, "the sale of a human being for debt is not a contract in this territory. Consent is not a word to bend. A marriage made with a barrel at the back of it, or with a purse, is not a marriage." He reached for the books on his table. It was dog-eared, and its cover had a corner bent like a man's ear after a fight. He opened it to a place marked with a strip of string and read under his breath and then above it so others could hear. He closed it with care. He looked at June. "Your name." "June Avery," she said. He dipped his pen. He wrote on a paper clean and folded it into a shape the county would recognize. The scratch of his pen climbed the room and fell. He sanded it, blew the grit tapped the corner, and signed in a hand that had put lines into this county for years. He stamped it with a seal that made the table dip and come back. "This court dissolves the pretended marriage," he said. "You are not bound to Mr. Sloane. You are free to hold your own name." He did not look at Barrett as he spoke. He looked at the room, then at June, and let the words belong to her before they belonged to paper. The sound men make when a thing shifts in a room went through the place. Barrett did not move his feet. His mouth went tight enough to pull the skin white along his jaw. He took a breath and set his hands on the table, as if to feel wood. Cade's toothpick stopped and rested on his tongue like a lie. The judge handed the paper to the clerk. The clerk stood, then hesitated. He would have to pass by Barrett or go the long way. He chose the long way. He came around the desk and put the folded paper into Cole's hand, because Cole's hand was there and steady. Cole turned and gave it to June. Her fingers closed. The paper was warm from the judge's hand and rough under hers, where the seal had pressed deep. The judge set his pen in its groove. "We are done," he said. Chairs scraped. A man coughed because he had been holding his breath. Someone laughed small and wrong and stopped when the sound ran into the wall and fell at his feet. Barrett did not look at June as he left. He walked as if the floor needed to be told that he walked on it. Cade followed close enough to be a shadow and far enough to be his own man. June stepped into the street, and the light laid a clean hand on her face. The paper lay against her ribs like another rib. Cole stood beside her and watched the sky for no reason but sky. The dog at the boardwalk stretched and yawned and settled again. A woman came out of the mercantile with a bolt of cloth and looked at June and looked away as if the day had asked for nothing but this much looking. They put their hands to the reins and swung up. June tucked the paper into the inside of her bodice and felt the small scratch of it through cloth. Cole set his hat and turned Smoke's head. They rode past the blacksmith's door and the place where the clerk had stood with his mouth a little open. The Coyote Star let out a chord from the piano and a laugh that did not catch. A boy ran with a hoop and stick and did not slow. The town slid behind them, not a chalk smear this time, but a thing with weight that had been lifted and set down. The land opened. The air smelled of wet grass and iron. June touched the spot where the seal had pushed the paper hard and thought of ink that had dried true. Cole rode easy. The horse's ears flicked to flies that were already back quick to find the day. The map in her head had shifted. Lines had moved. Names had taken their own shape. They followed the trail that went home. They topped the last rise and the world smelled wrong. Not pine, not wet earth. Burn. A thin line of gray pulled straight into the sky from the shelf of rock where the cabin sat. Cole put his knees to Smoke without a word. June kept the dun mare tight behind. The coulee opened, and there it was. The roof had fallen in. The walls had leaned, then given, then blackened into a low jag that still smoked in places. The woodpile under the lean-to had gone to cinders and bright nails that caught the light. The door lay flat with a dark handprint on it where someone had set it down after fire had done its work. Cole swung down. Heat pushed at his shins through his pants as he walked the edge. June slid from the saddle and felt the ground warm as a stovestone under the thin soles of the boots. She stood with her arms at her sides while ash lifted and settled like tired snow. The stove had collapsed and cracked. The blue cup had lost its shape and slumped to a puddle of glass that still held color. The little wooden bird was there on the sill line, burnt to a curl at the breast. One wing lay whole beside the ash-carved feathers, black and gray and still clear. June picked it up. It was light. The soot came away on her skin and drew lines she would not wipe. Cole moved in a slow square eyes down. He made a map in his head. He stopped by the pegs that were just black stubs now. He crouched by the place the table had been. He stood where the bed had stood and looked at the floor without seeing it. Smoke stood with head low and blew once, then was still. June found the map on the wall, or what was left of it. Paper had become lace. Some lines stayed. The North Pass mark showed as a ghost. She was careful of it and then let it go and stepped back without knowing why. She put the wing into the pocket over her heart. It sat light against the paper the judge had signed. Cole came back to her with ash at his knees and jaw. He looked through the black into the places where boots had stood and walked. He tasted wind and thought about it and turned his head east. A quiet settled over his face. "He left us the horses," he said. June understood. Men who meant them dead would have taken the stock or shot them. Men who wanted them seen left them. Whoever had lit the match had thought about how wind moved and how smoke rose. He had wanted a message to run. Cole wiped his fingers on his shirt and did not take the black away. He stepped to smoke and checked the cinch like a man at a fence post, slow and exact. June felt the coat of the fire press its weight around her and knew she would not carry anything else from here. She tied the Dun's reins short, put a hand to the horn, and swung up. They rode south until the air changed to dust and sage, and the smoke smell lay behind like a stain. They crossed a dry arroyo and then another. The day pulled long. Shadows stood up out of rock and walked beside them, then slid away. June drank from the canteen and handed it to Cole. He did not drink. He tipped a little into his palm and rubbed it on Smoke's flank where a patch of white hair grew, then handed the rest back. By dark, the land opened into a high table that broke toward the east. A house grew out of the slope, half stone and half sod, as if the hill had been asked to raise a shoulder and had done it. A porch of heavy planks faced a canyon that ran away to the horizon. From there, a man could see a rider an hour out. 2 lamps burned inside, steady and low. The door stood open as if air needed to come and go. A tall man stepped onto the porch with a rifle cradled in his arm. His skin held the red of sun and wind. His hair had gone to gray at the temples and stayed black everywhere else. His eyes were steady and brown and took a thing in without wasting time on surprise. "Cole," he said. Isaiah Cole said. They did not reach for each other. They did not need to. June slid down from the saddle and held to the horn a second, because her legs remembered heat and ash and needed to learn this ground. Smoke blew out and shook once. The Dun lowered her head to crop at a tuft of grass that had fought a living in stone. Isaiah Boone looked from Cole to June, and then to the horses with no packs, and then to the line of ash on Cole's shirt. He gave a small nod that meant he had seen enough. "You are late for supper," he said. Ruth kept a pot warm. A woman came into the doorway with a towel over one shoulder. She was small and strong and wore her hair wrapped in a clean cloth. Her hands were quick and sure. She stepped down and took June by the elbow, not in a claim but to steady. "Come in," she said. "You will both sit. We will set plates." Inside, the house smelled of beans and onion and bread. The table had a scar that ran the length where someone long ago had set a hot pan wrong. A clean bed stood against one wall with a patchwork spread. A rifle leaned in the corner by habit. The walls were thick enough to hold weather outside. June sat and felt the chair hold her, as if it knew a person would sit there tired. Ruth set bowls and a plate of bread and a wedge of cheese. She poured coffee and slid the cups to hands that did not know they were ready to hold them. "Eat," she said. Her voice had the sound of a bell rung for the right reasons. Isaiah stood behind Cole's chair and did not sit yet. "Word in Whitlow," he said, quiet. He named no names. "A man burned a place north. He did not say yours." Cole nodded. He took a spoon of beans into his mouth and chewed and swallowed before he spoke. "Ours." June held the bread like she had never seen it. She tore a piece and dipped it into the broth at the edge of the beans and ate. The food went into her and broke apart the heart inside her chest that had formed at the sight of this fallen roof. She kept the next bite small, because hands that shake drop big things. Isaiah set his rifle against the wall and pulled a chair out with his foot. He sat. His voice stayed even. "There is more. Sloan is paying. 500 on a scarred man took his wife. 200 on the girl. Dead pays the same as delivered." The words laid themselves down like iron. June stopped chewing. The sound of her own blood got loud. She put the bread on the plate with care and looked at her hands. There was soot in the lines and a new cut where a board had kissed bone. She felt small as a thing in the pocket of a coat not hers. Cole looked at Isaiah, and then at Ruth, and then at the table. He did not look at June first. When he did, his eyes were dark and held no pity that would break her. His voice had a rough on it. He burned the cabin. Ruth set a hand to the table between June's and the plate. Her fingers were warm and had flour in the creases. She left a small white mark on the wood by accident and wiped it away with her thumb without thinking. "Men will talk here," she said. "Then they will stop, then they will eat. You will sleep when the words are done." She rose and found a pan to scrub because hands do better when they are asked to work. Isaiah leaned back until the chair found a balance. Cade Mercer was seen riding through with 3 men not from here. They were hired. Sloan's money on their minds. They asked after the pass. They asked after you, but not by your names. He let the chair come forward again and laid both palms on the table as if to show he kept them empty. "My door is not a big door. It is enough." June's breath, which had been there and then not, came back in a piece and then another. She looked at Cole. His jaw had set and the scar at his mouth pulled hard. She wanted him to tell her something gentle and easy that would make the room soft. He did not. "This is your life now, June," he said. "You wrote and you stood, and now this is what walks in the door after those things." He did not raise his voice and he did not make the words heavy. He put them on the table like the cup of coffee Ruth had put there. "I am in it with you. I chose that. You are not a curse. You are hunted. Those are not the same thing." The words went through her and found places to sit. She looked at Ruth's hands and Isaiah's eyes and the steady line of Cole's shoulders. She felt the paper against her skin where she had put it that morning. She felt the wing in her pocket. She reached in and touched the carved feather points and left soot on her fingertips again. She wiped it on her skirt. The black smudged and lightened. Ruth brought a small pot and set it down. "Tea," she said. "Something that is not coffee." June held the cup and let the steam rise into her face and wake her eyes. She drank, and it was bitter and green and good. Isaiah stood. He went to the door and looked out across the canyon. The sky held a thin comb of cloud. The wind had gone light. A hawk hung out there, and did not need to move much to stay where it wanted. Isaiah watched until he had counted what a man could see from his porch, and then came back in. "You can use the back room," he said to June. "Bed is made, sheets clean. If you hear a noise in the night, it is wind or it is me. No one else walks here without me telling him to." June nodded and stood. Her legs were unsure, and then sure. In the small room, a window cut a square on the wall, where the light went when the moon was up. A quilt in blues and browns lay smooth. She sat on the edge and let her hands rest on her knees. The wing in her pocket tapped against the paper, in a small sound she could feel more than hear. Outside, Cole and Isaiah sat on the porch, with their chairs tipped and their boots on the plank rail. They said little. Cole's hand went to the coffee cup and back. Isaiah's hand went to the rifle stock and back. Light fell into the canyon until the rock held it, and then let it go. June lay back and watched the square of dark on the wall. She listened to the low talk of two men who had built their lives around quiet. She heard Ruth put a pan to soak and blow out one of the lamps and leave the other to burn at half. The house breathed in and out. The ash smell had worn off her hair. The tea sat warm behind her ribs. She put her hand flat on her chest and felt the press of the seal through the cloth. The other hand held the wing until her fingers learned its shape. She closed her eyes and the house held. Isaiah walked the rim at first light and traced the canyon in the dust with a stick. His lines were clean, the mouth wide as a meadow, the walls leaning in, the narrows a thin throat where rock pressed rock. He tapped the narrow with the stick and looked at June and Cole. They stood with him, boots on grit breath in white threads that faded fast. The morning smelled of juniper and wet stone. A hawk cut a slow circle far out over the east. Isaiah pointed to a ledge above the narrows on the north wall. "Good shelf. A man can lie there flat and not slide." He pointed across to a darker crease on the south face. There, too. He nudged 2 pebbles into his sketch to mark the spots. His eyes moved over the real rock and the drawn rock and found the same places in both. They started with stone. Isaiah chose a row of boulders set loose by winter thaw, each the size of a steer's chest. Cole wedged a pry bar under the first, while Isaiah drove a wedge of dead juniper under the back to hold it. June kept the rawhide lines straight and ready. She tied a timber hitch around the belly of the boulder, then set 2 half hitches snug. Her hands moved without waste. The rope bit and held. Isaiah tested the lashings with a grunt. He did not say good. He set his weight to the bar again. June backed away, paid out line, then hooked the free end over a trigger branch they had planted as a lever. One pull from the shelf would take the wedge and set the stone moving. They built 3 of those along the north wall and 2 along the south. Each one sat quiet with a new patience. Ruth brought water in a crock, and a towel hung on her shoulder. "Drink," she said, at a place where the south wall threw shade. June lifted the dipper and let the cold touch her lips, then her tongue, then the back of her throat. She felt the ache lift from her arms in a small way. Ruth watched her drink, then set the crock near the juniper stump and checked the knots with her own hands. She did not speak. She let the rope tell her what it had to say. When she was satisfied, she nodded once and went back toward the house with her skirt gathered in one hand to clear the sage. They worked the ground next. Isaiah chose a bend just before the narrows where the trail pinched and widened like the waist of a bottle. They dug a shallow pit there wide as a door. The soil was tough with roots and small rock. Cole cut through it with a mattock and did not hurry. June shoveled and pushed, then gathered brush to lay over the hole when it was ready. They laced a lattice with willow and thin juniper. June tied with square knots and clove hitches and tucked each tail down neat. She tested every tie with a hard pull until the lattice was a single thing. "We string the cans last," Isaiah said when they stood and looked at the pit and the stonework, like men who had put a fence up in a day. He pointed to a line along the brush near ankle height. "They will talk in wind." "That is fine. Wind is our talk. Feet that do not belong have a sound." In the yard, Ruth had set a table in the shade. She rolled bandages from a bolt of muslin and wound them tight and clean. She kept a pot of water just under a simmer on the stove and dropped needles in and took them out with a spoon. June came to the table with her hands scratched and her throat dry. Ruth looked at her fingers and laid out a small kit. She showed June how to fold a pad and wrap from the inside of a limb to the out. She showed where to tie off so the knot would not bite. She made June take the cloth and do it twice more until the wrap sat smooth and even. "Salve," Ruth said, and opened a crock. "Pine Bear Fat Beeswax. Put it on after clean and before wrap. Do not be stingy." June breathed in the green of it and the sweet. She rubbed a bit into her own scraped knuckles and felt the sting turn to a throb, and then to a quiet. Cole took June to the north shelf when the light went soft. He lay on his belly and slid the rifle over a flat rock. He tapped the stock with his knuckles. "Your cheek here, your shoulder behind it. Breathe and sink." He set a tin can on a dead cedar across the narrows. It was small against all that rock. June settled in. The stone under her ribs was warm from the day. She felt the rifle sit along her bones. The first shot punched the air and came back from the walls with a long, thin echo. Dust jumped above the can and drifted. She blinked at the noise, then set the sight again. She breathed out and squeezed. The second shot walked the dust closer. The third rang the can. The sound was high and clean and went away quick. "Again," Cole said. She shot until the can wore a mouth and then fell. When her shoulder throbbed, she tucked a folded strip of cloth between the stock and her shirt. Cole said nothing about it. He moved the can and set it farther and let the work speak. He gave her the pistol and stood with his hands on his hips and watched her draw and fire into the dirt bank at 10 paces. He corrected only once. "Not the wrists," he said. "Your elbows." He stepped behind her and moved one elbow a hair, then stepped away again like a man moving a brush on a shelf away from the edge. By late day, the shelf had learned their shapes. June could lift the rifle from the rock and set it down without looking. Over on the south side, Isaiah lay quiet with his own gun. He lifted a hand when their eyes met, then went back to watching the trail. They strung the cans at dusk. Isaiah had saved a sack of tins in the shed for years, the bottoms punched with small holes. June ran wire low across the wash and tied a can every few steps, some higher, some low. She dropped a pebble in each. When the wind came down the canyon in a slow river, the pebbles clicked against the metal in a thin, light talk. Isaiah stood with his head tipped. "That is the sound," he said. "Remember it." Ruth lit one lamp and left it on the table inside. She had set bread aside and a pot of beans and a small pan of fried potatoes. She poured coffee and tea and filled plates without ceremony. June sat the rope tar still on her fingertips and the smell of gun oil in her hair. Cole ate with the clean hunger of a man who had worked a day. Isaiah's plate emptied in a pattern that said he was watching while he chewed. Ruth ate slow, then stood and washed what was not in use. The stove spoke in low clicks. The small lamp made a gold circle on the table. When the plates were clean and the last of the coffee gone, Isaiah rolled a map of the canyon he had sketched on butcher paper and set it by the door. He went to the porch and took a chair to the corner where he could see the rim and the lay of the juniper beyond. Cole set a rifle near the door and a pistol on the table and a handful of cartridges in a small bowl. He wiped the metal with a rag and oil until it shone clean but not bright. June sat with a coil of rope over her knees and began to braid a new lead from 3 thinner lines. Her hands remembered the comb and the braid they had made of her own hair. The same motion tighter, over and under pull and smooth. The rope took shape strong and even. She tied the finish with a sailor's knot Isaiah had taught her at noon and burned the ends in the flame to seal them. She held the new length up. It had weight and a rightness. Cole watched her hands and then looked away because there are some things a man respects by not staring. He reached for the canteen and tipped it toward her. She drank and set it back. He touched her knuckles with a finger. Not a claim, a check. "You good?" he said. "Good," she said. Ruth came with a roll of bandage and set it in the bowl with the cartridges. Water on the counter, needles boiled and wrapped, cloth ready. Her voice was quiet. June nodded. Ruth touched June's shoulder once and went to the sink to fill a kettle, and set it where it could simmer. They checked the boulders again in the last light. Each wedge held. Each line lay where it should. Each trigger stick sat ready. Isaiah stood under one with his hand on the wedge and looked up at the sky. He listened to wind and stone talk to each other and decided they were friends enough. Dark found them on the rim. The cans along the wash spoke in a thin chime when a breath of night moved through sage. The sound ran the length of the string and died. June lay on the shelf and rested her cheek on the stock and watched the narrows grow black. Cole lay across from her on the other shelf with his chin on his forearm, his breath slow. Isaiah sat higher with his knees up and the rifle steady along them. Ruth kept a lamp low in the house and the door open for air. She moved inside with the small noises of a woman who knew where each thing belonged. The stars laid out. The canyon held their light and made it cooler. The rawhide in June's hands felt smooth from use. The smell of pine lifted and fell. Somewhere far, a nightbird called twice and was quiet. The cans did not talk again for a long time. The lines they had set waited. The stone waited. The people who had made the place ready breathed and watched and let the dark be what it was. The cans spoke once, a light tick that ran the wire and faded. Isaiah's hand lifted and held. June lay quiet on the north shelf. The rock under her smelled of dust and sun turned cold. The narrows below was a gray slit. Hoof scuff. A whisper of leather. 4 riders slid into the choke point with their horses at a walk. Hats low, coats dark. The first looked up as if the canyon itself had made a sound he did not know. He saw nothing. He kept moving. Cole's rifle cracked. The first rider tipped sideways as if sleep had taken him. His boot hung in the stirrup for a breath, then let go. The horse shied and slammed the second into the wall. Shouts. Gunfire jumped wild and white against rock. The canyon took each shot and gave it back thinner. Now Isaiah called. The rope in June's hands felt alive. She pulled hard. The wedge kicked. Stone spoke in a deeper voice. The boulder rolled. It gathered the dust of a winter on its face and thundered into the narrows. A horse screamed. A second stone came from the south wall, slow and certain. Rock met rock and closed the back of the throat. The way out was gone. A rider threw himself off and ran for cover. Another stayed with his horse and fired up at the ledges with his jaw clenched and his eyes mean. Chips jerked from the rock by June's cheek and stung her skin. She slid the rifle forward cheek to stock breath let out. The nearest man knelt by a chalk-colored boulder and slapped his revolver open to feed it. His hat brim showed, a shoulder, a hand. She took the sight into that space between him and air and squeezed. The rifle bucked. The man folded and did not rise. Her stomach turned over. She swallowed it down and worked to the bolt. Across the way, Cole fired, and the sound echoed like a thrown plate. His second shot hit the rim of a saddle where a third rider had crouched. Leather burst. The man rolled and crawled deeper into the shadow of a crack in the wall. He fired blind up the slope. One of his shots chewed the edge of Cole's shelf. Grit fell. June flinched at the sound in her teeth. The last rider was smarter. He slid from rock to rock, keeping the wall at his back, eyes on the shelves. His hat was gone. His hair lay wet against his skull. He moved left. Cole tracked him, waiting for the body to make a line. June saw what Cole saw. She did not breathe. The man fired. Fire jumped in Cole's direction. Cole's rifle cracked in answer. The man kept coming. He had the canyon in his head. He would try to climb, not shoot it out. He went for the notch under Cole's shelf. A shot and a sound that was not air. Cole jerked. His rifle skittered forward. His body slid from the shelf to a ledge 10 feet down and hit hard. A wet mark spread under his hand where it pressed his side. Cole, June said, and it came out as a dry scrape. I have him, Isaiah called. His voice held like a rope thrown true. Stay your place. The smart one laughed. The sound was small and high. He moved faster, using the spill of rock as steps. He had the angle now. Isaiah fired. Stone spit white along the man's shoulder. He ducked and came on. June set the rifle aside. She took the pistol from her belt. The grip fit her hand, and her hand closed without shake. She slid off the shelf and found the holds with her feet. The wall was cold and rude. Her palm skin squealed against it and ripped. She went down a path her body knew without thought, and came out level with the notch. The man heard rock fall and turned his head. His eyes widened. He was in the open for a breath. She lifted the pistol, 2 hands, elbows soft, like Cole had taught. The front sight found his chest. She squeezed. He looked surprised when the bullet took him. She fired again because Cole had said not to count on one. The man fell backward and slid until a stone stopped him, with a sound like meat hitting a block. The air went still, except for the hiss of dust. June moved to Cole. He lay with one knee bent. He had pressed his palm to his right side high on the ribs. Blood pushed through his fingers and looked black under the ledge's shade. His eyes were open and set hard on her face as if he could hold her there by will. "You stay," she said. She stripped her belt and pulled the bandana from his neck. She pressed the cloth into the wound. He made a sound in his throat when she pushed. She put the weight of her hand there. His breath came fast and shallow. She took the belt and looped it around his chest above the wound and set the buckle. She pulled the free end and watched the blood slow. He sucked in a breath and let it out through his teeth. "Rope," she called. A coil dropped from the rim and thumped the rock near her feet. Isaiah's voice came down with it. "Tie him. I have you." She tied the rope around Cole with a bowline that would not slip. She checked it with 2 hard pulls and then another. She tied the line to a knob of rock, then made a second loop and put it under his arms. She took a third tie for herself, set fast around her own waist. "Ready," she said. The line went tight. The cliff face felt the strain and held. Isaiah's feet moved above. June guided Cole up the ledge, stepping him when he could lift his legs, hauling when he could not. He made a low sound each time the stone touched his side. She put her body between him and the wall where she could. Her shoulder took scrapes she did not taste. They reached the lip. Isaiah's hands came down and took Cole's weight and lifted. They got him to the shelf. June put her palm back where it belonged on the wound. Her other hand found his wrist. His pulse jackrabbited and then steadied. She looked for his eyes. He found hers. "You did fine," he said. His voice was a dry leaf. "Save the talk," she said. Isaiah slid along the shelf to the edge and looked down. The 2 men near the rockfall lay still. The first man had not moved since Cole's first shot. The smart one lay face down with his hand open on the stone. The 4th horse stood with wide eyes and flanks heaving wedged at the back of the choke where the stones had narrowed the trail. Its rider was under a slab with 1 boot visible and empty. Isaiah held up a hand and turned his palm from side to side. Clear enough. He came back and looked at the tie June had made, and the belt turned into a band. He nodded once. Not praise. Agreement. "Ruth," he called toward the house. "Bring water, bandage, needle, and thread." Her answer rose thin and strong from the yard. "Coming." June checked Cole's side again. The cloth had gone red and then darker. She lifted a corner saw the hole, saw that it was high and clean, an in and an out. Relief brought a tremor to her elbows. She breathed it away. She pressed fresh cloth from a roll in her pocket and tightened the belt another notch. Cole's mouth set and relaxed. "He is not drowned inside," Isaiah said, reading the way blood ran and where it lay. His hands were steady. He set them on Cole's shoulders and took some of the work of keeping him still. Ruth climbed the path with a basket on her arm and a kettle and a towel. Her breath was fast, but her hands were calm. She knelt and set the basket open and laid out what she had brought on the flat rock. Water, bandage, thread, and needle. Salve. She looked once at Cole's face. He looked back and found his jaw again. "We need you still," she said to him. He was. She looked at June. "We trade," she said. June moved her hand, and Ruth's hand replaced it in the same spot with the same weight. June took the needle and the thread because her fingers were small and knew fine work. Ruth wet the cloth and wiped away blood until she saw the edges. She poured a thread of water that steamed where it touched skin, still hot from fight. Cole breathed slow and did not lift his shoulder into the touch. June set the needle and pulled. Skin bent and met. She pulled again and tied off neat. The stitch line ran small and close and true. Cole made no sound. Ruth pressed the pad down and smoothed the bandage over it. She tied it with a clean strip. Isaiah's palm stayed steady on Cole's other shoulder, like a post in a strong wind. "We move him now," Isaiah said. He looked at the path. He looked at the grade. "We take him to the house on a board." He stood and went for one. June brushed stray hair from Cole's forehead. His eyes tracked her hand. "You here," he said. "Here," she said. Isaiah came back with a door taken from the shed and 2 fence rails. He and Ruth rigged a litter fast with rope that still carried the warmth of June's palms. They slid it under Cole and lifted on a count. Cole grunted. June walked beside with one hand on the bandage and the other steadying his head. The path that had seemed simple that morning felt different with weight and breath and the measure of a man on it. They set him on the table inside. Ruth cut away what was left of his shirt and washed his side again. She set a pot on the stove to boil and put the needle back to heat before handing it to June. June set 2 more stitches where the skin had split from the move. Ruth packed the wound with cloth and salve and tied a clean wrap that ran under his arm and over the opposite shoulder. "Drink," Ruth said, and tipped a cup to Cole's lips. The water went in small and stayed. Isaiah stood inside the door with the rifle and watched the canyon through the wedge of window. His breath went in and out slow. He did not change. The room settled into work sounds. The stove ticked. The kettle hissed. The coil of rope on the chair back held the shape of the hands that had tied it. The paper on the shelf rustled when the draft reached it. June wiped blood from her fingers and felt how dry her mouth had gone. She drank from a cup Ruth set near her hand and tasted iron and stone and the faint fat of the meat she had eaten at noon. Isaiah went back out when the light shifted and set his hat brim low. He climbed to the rim and moved along it like a line. He checked the bodies without hurry. He took guns and set them aside and kicked dirt over embers where a man had set a cigarette and forgot it. He tied the unhurt horse and led him to the yard. He stood with his hand on the animal's neck until the shake went out of the body. He came in and set the pistols in a wooden box under the table. He did not speak until he had washed his hands and dried them. 4, he said, no more. Ruth nodded and put a hand flat on the table because it felt good to touch wood. June sat by Cole and watched his chest rise and fall. The line steadied. The skin along his mouth slackened a fraction. She laid her palm on the bandage and felt the heat there and the pulse under it. Outside, the wind turned and came down the canyon as a cool hand. The cans along the wash spoke once and were quiet. The boulders that had moved sat where they had been meant to sit. Rock held rock. The narrows lay still with gun smoke thinning along the ground, like a fog that did not know how to stay. Ruth lifted the lamplight until the room glowed. She set a pot of broth where it would not boil, only breathe. Isaiah took the chair by the door and let the stock of the rifle rest on his thigh. He watched the dark take the last of the day from the rim. June folded clean cloth and stacked it. She put the needle and thread back in the tin and closed the lid. She looked at Cole's face and found the quiet there that belonged to sleep instead of shock. She let her own breath slow to meet it. The house held. The canyon listened. Night took its place and stayed. The fever ran hot for 3 nights. June sat by the table where they had laid Cole and kept the cloth cool in a bowl. Ruth traded places with her when June's eyes closed and would not open. Isaiah moved through the rooms at the soft hours, filling the kettle setting, fresh wood against the stove, listening to the wind. Cole wake at dawn of the 4th day. His eyes found the beam above him, then the ceiling seam, then the line of June's shoulder. He watched her breathe before she knew he was watching. When she stirred, he swallowed once and tried to lift his head. She put a hand to his chest, and he let it stay there. "Drink," Ruth said, and held a cup to his mouth. He took water in slow sips and closed his eyes as if the weight had become something he could carry again. The color eased back under his skin a shade at a time. June changed the bandage and tied off the wrap so it crossed his shoulder and held true. Her stitches lay small and close. When she pulled the knot, she felt the pull in her own chest like a stitch had caught there too. Days began to stack in a new order. Morning light crossed the floor in a steady path. Cole sat up, then stood with June's shoulder under his hand, then took 3 steps to the door and 3 steps back. At the porch rail, he held himself straight and breathed as if the air needed counting. The scar at his mouth dragged when a laugh almost came and did not. He slept in the back room, where the window held a square of sky. June slept in a chair until Ruth shooed her toward a bed and set a folded quilt under her head. Isaiah brought a coil of wire and a sack of nails from a shelf that ran high along the wall. He set them on the table and looked out across the canyon. His finger tapped once on the wood. "There is a spring up the north draw," he said. "Good water. A shelf above it catches sun. The ground will hold a wall if you ask it the right way." They walked there when Cole's legs had found their use. The spring came out of rock with a quiet that never stopped. Grass grew thick where it ran, and then thinned where the soil gave up to stone. The shelf faced south and west. A stand of juniper made a rough corner where a house could tuck. "Here," Isaiah said. June knelt and pressed her palm flat to the damp ground. The cold climbed her wrist. She looked at Cole. He looked at the place where the door would be, and at the turn of shade the junipers would throw. He nodded once. They cut sod in rectangles and stacked them like books. Stone came from the wash in a barrow that washed June's hands in grit. Cole set the base with a level eye and a rope line. Isaiah swung a sledge and split rock where it told him to hit. Ruth brought bread wrapped in a towel and a crock of water with lemon slices that turned the smell of the day to clean. Walls rose to a man's shoulder. A corner took shape. Smoke would need a way out, so they laid a chimney from stone that fit close like fingers. June worked mud and straw into chink, and pressed it with the heel of her hand until the seam held. The work turned the skin of her palms shiny and tough. She set the window frame square and true so it would not bind when heat and cold pulled at it. Isaiah set a beam, and Cole stood at one end and shouldered the other until it sat home. They slept under Isaiah's roof until the new walls had done enough to keep night out. The day they moved the table in June, set a cloth over it and held the edge for a long count. The house smelled of damp earth and pine, and the first curl of smoke from new stone. Cole touched the corner with his palm as a man touches a shoulder to make sure it holds. They rode into Whitlow for glass and seed and thread. People watched with the kind of attention a town gives when it wants a story to feed itself. June walked into the mercantile with a clean sack under her arm. She set a row of small leather pouches on the counter, each stitched tight and even. The shopkeeper put his fingers to the seams and lifted one to the light. He turned it and made a sound in his throat that was not a word. "Store credit or coin," June said. "Coin," he said, and put silver on the counter between them without looking at Cole. June bought flour coffee, a pane of glass wrapped in paper packets of seed, marked with careful pictures. Beans, squash, beets, a twist of onion sets. She touched a bolt of calico, the color of wildflowers washed by sun, and put it back and then took it again. She paid and tied the bundle tight. On the porch, a woman paused with a loaf in her basket and looked at June's face and then at the scar on Cole's. Her mouth thinned. She turned away as if the road had called her name. The sound from the coyote star rolled out and fell on the boardwalk like dice. News found them at the counter as the shopkeeper wrapped the glass. "Heard this morning," he said. "Barrett Sloan is dead, in his own study. A letter knife." The word ran low. "Folks say Cade Mercer runs the place now, or the bank does. Depends who you ask." Cole's jaw did not move. June took the bundle and stepped aside so a man with nails could pay for them. The paper around the glass rasped under her palm. They rode home plain. The road gave a little under the horses. The sun sat clean behind them. Neither spoke. Isaiah met them at the yard and took the glass in both hands. Ruth put the seeds in a bowl as if the bowl had waited for that task alone. They set the pane in the frame with putty soft as bread and pinned it with small nails. June held her breath through each tap. When it was done, the room changed. Light took a new shape on the floor. Dust hung in it like small notes of a song. In the corner, June took the curved wing she had carried and wiped it free of soot with a cloth. The carved feathers still held their lines. She set a nail above the window and hung the wing from a bit of leather. It turned a little in air, the way a real wing might think about air even when it could not fly. Ruth brought a new blue comb from a box where she had kept 3 for guests and set it on the shelf. It was not the same shade as the one that had slumped to glass. It caught the light differently. It held. Cole turned it in his hand once and put it back where it could watch a day. They broke the ground below the spring where sun stayed long. Cole drove the spade into soil that had more stone than a person would wish. June picked rocks into a basket until the basket learned the shape of her calves. Isaiah showed the lay where water would run without taking the soil with it. He set a small channel from the spring and packed the sides with clay until the water behaved. Ruth planted onion sets with her thumb and 2 fingers and tapped the soil above each one, as if she were closing small eyes. June opened the packets and shook seed into her palm. Beans looked like small stones painted by a hand that had run out of patience and found grace. Squash felt light and dry. She knelt and pressed each seed in with 2 fingers and covered it. Cole followed and tamped the ground with a flat of his palm. Their hands dirted to the wrist and went brown at the nails. Water ran clear in the channel and then turned dark where it soaked the fresh row. The smell rose green and wet and new. They ate on the step that evening, bowls on their knees, steam making a thin ghost in the cooling air. The canyon took the light and held it in red. Isaiah told a story about a horse that had learned to lift a latch and let itself into the yard. Ruth shook her head and said the horse had learned it from Isaiah, not the other way. June laughed, and the sound went out across the wash and came back smaller. Later, June and Cole stood in the doorway of the new room. The window held a square of sky where a single star had shown up early. The wooden wing hung still. June set the paper with the judge's seal in a small tin and slid it under a folded shirt. Cole watched her do it and looked away, not because he did not want to see, but because he knew what it meant to keep a thing safe, where only one pair of hands would go. The bed was a frame Cole and Isaiah had made from juniper, the knots showing like eyes in the wood. June spread a quilt Ruth had pieced. The fabric ran in lines of blue and dark brown and a red that looked deep even in low light. Cole sat and eased himself down and made a sound that was half ache and half relief. June sat beside him and set her palm on his chest where a bandage lay under the shirt. His hand found her wrist. He lifted it and kissed the heel of it and let it go. In the night, Cole woke once with his hand on the bed as if finding the floor out of habit. June touched his shoulder and he stilled. He lay with his eyes open until the shape of the window told him where he was. He breathed and the breath made a small sound. The house held that sound without changing it. Morning came thin and bright. A wind ran from the north and then left. June filled a bucket at the spring and carried it to the row where they had pressed beans into the earth. She tilted the dipper and let water go easy so it did not cut the soil. Cole brought a shovel and a spade and leaned them where tools lean when they have done right work. Isaiah stood with his coffee at the rim and watched the line where sky meets rock. Ruth dusted flour across a board and turned dough into biscuits with 3 firm presses. June tucked a stray hair behind her ear and looked at her hands. Dirt sat in the half moons. Salve smell clung at the cracks. She reached for Cole's hand and turned it palm up. Rope lines lay there, and the faint new scar of a stitch the needle had caught when she was learning. She set her palm against it, and the 2 hands fit without trying. They walked to the patch together. June sank to her knees and pressed another seed into the loosened earth. Cole kneeled beside her and tamped it with care. Water moved in the channel and brightened the ground. The air filled with the clean of wet soil and the hint of coffee from Ruth's kitchen. June leaned back and looked at the window of the house. The glass held a square of sky. The wing cast a small shadow that moved a little when the air moved. She took a breath that went all the way down. Cole looked at her and did not speak. He set his palm over the back of her hand. They stayed a moment like that, knees in the dirt, the world around them working as it always had. Then they set another row, and another, the seed small, and the earth close, the water running beside them, steady and clear. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.